please like, comment, subscribe, share. You can do that on a number of platforms by watching us here on Facebook. We have it on Instagram. We have it on Twitter. Also, you can listen to us. Maybe you want to go about your daily routine. You're walking to work. If you're able to, you might want to listen to us. Do that on Castbox, Spotify, Google Music, iTunes, you name it. We're out there trying to push back against the ever-moving Liberal agenda. As always, an amazing show lined up for you. In the second half, we have Greg McLean. He's the Member of Parliament for Calgary Centre. He's also the Deputy Shadow Minister for National Revenue. We're going to talk about some of the spending measures the Liberals have implemented during the COVID-19 crisis and the fact that at some point we have to pay these bills back. But first, we have an amazing representative, a Member of Parliament for Wellington-Halton Hills, Michael Chong. Thank you so much for joining us. You're also the Shadow Minister for Democratic Institutions. Appreciate the time.
Great to be here, Jamie. Lindsay's a great place. I had a friend who lived there once. I think it's the home of the Sir Sam Hughes Royal Canadian Legion branch.
Wow, that's impressive. Yes, it is. It is probably the best patio in town. It overlooks the water. It's elevated. It is a great spot to hang out on the sunny afternoon. So good memory. Well done.
Great town.
And of course, in Kawartha Lakes is the home of Kawartha Dairy. You always have to give that a plug if possible.
Good ice cream. Not going to say whether the Chapmans or not.
That's right. Well, I know you ran over. You were just in question period in committee. Because fake parliament's running right now because the Liberals and NDP have come up with a deal that they would suspend the powers of Parliament. Maybe you could tell us a bit about it for those listeners and viewers just joining us and trying to figure out what's going on in Ottawa.
Well, the House of Commons has been shut down. It's been shut down since March 13th. And with the deal that the Liberals cooked up with the NDP, the House of Commons will be shuttered till September 21st. So what is meeting right now is not the House of Commons. It's a committee, and it's a committee that is neutered. It has very few powers. It essentially only allows for three things. It allows members to give statements. It allows members to ask questions, and allows members to introduce petitions. But beyond those three things, it has no power. It has no power to introduce motions or legislation, no power to test confidence, no power to vote. And so it is a mere shadow of the full powers of the people's place, the House of Commons. And so I think the House of Commons needs to reopen, and I think the people need to have their representation.
Now, what about the NDP? They voted with the Liberals to do this. So they came up with a price saying they want the federal government to negotiate with the provinces for 10 paid sick days, given that we're in the COVID-19 crisis. Isn't that something they could have negotiated in Parliament to keep it going? Like, how is democracy worth 10 sick days? Isn't it worth a lot more than that?
I agree. I think the NDP made a big mistake. I think they're probably realizing that in retrospect. I certainly believe that they will realize that as the weeks and months drag on and the government continues to spend without parliamentary approval, continues to make decisions without parliamentary approval. I think by the time Labor Day comes around, I think the NDP will realize that they made a big mistake. Parliament needs to reopen. We cannot have a functioning democracy without the people's representation. You know, Parliament and the House of Commons sat through 2 world wars, sat through the October crisis of October 1970, during the weeks and days that followed the kidnapping of the British Trade Commissioner and Pierre Laporte. It didn't suspend itself. It deliberated, it made decisions. It sat through previous pandemics that we've had in this country. I think shuttering the House of Commons in the 4 to 6 weeks after the pandemic was declared on Wednesday, March 11th was prudent and appropriate. But by the time the end of April, early May came around, it was clear that we could manage the reopening of the House with social distancing and ensure greater accountability. The government has decided it's too inconvenient to have to meet the House and worked out this deal to suspend Parliament till the middle of September.
Now, this decision by the Liberals and NDP raised a bunch of concerns, and I don't let them block off this off the hook either, because during the first round negotiations, they were all with the Liberals and only recently broke away. But the Parliamentary Budget Officer has even come in on this, saying that basically we're going to approve MPs $150 billion in spending in just about 4 hours. That's the most expensive 4 hours in history. Maybe give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Hundreds of billions of dollars are going out the door without any parliamentary oversight. Laws are being changed without parliamentary oversight. The Employment Insurance Act gave the minister the power through a ministerial order to change legislation without having to pass it through the House of Commons and Senate. The government's gained these extraordinary powers and is continuing to use them right till the end of September without parliamentary oversight. Setting aside 4 hours to review the estimates in June is not even worth considering something that's legitimate. 4 hours to review that amount of estimates without having the committees review it in greater detail, without having committee hearings, is simply a farce. Look, I think it was prudent to suspend the House of Commons during the early days of this pandemic, maybe for 4 to 6 weeks. But by the time early May came around, we knew what we were dealing with. We knew that this virus was particularly fatal for people over the age of 60, 70 years of age. It was really targeting people in old age homes and long-term care facilities. And we knew that people could start to gather in numbers with social distancing that allowed for business to return to normal. Parliament is an essential service. It's at times like crises like this, Jamie, that our bedrock principles are tested. Principles like human rights and freedoms, principles like the rule of law, principles like democracy. Previous crises that we've seen in this country, whether it's the 2 world wars, Korea, the October crisis, Parliament survived the test. It sat through those challenging times and met the crisis. Parliament has failed the test. The government has shuttered Parliament, and it needs to reopen.
I agree. I think you're always the voice of reason, Michael Chong. I do appreciate that. But we're asking people working at the local coffee shop or the grocery store who are seeing hundreds of people to go into work and do their jobs. And of course, MPs are working in their constituency. I know all of us have, regardless of political stripe. But the fact that the other half of our job, examining legislation, making laws, is being put on the side, and orders in councils such as the firearms ban are being thrown through basically with the stroke of a pen.
That's right. There's no oversight over much of what the government's doing. We're saddling our children's generation with billions of dollars, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in additional debt. The country is about to be plunged into the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression, possibly even greater than that. And Parliament has been shuttered. As I said before, the first 4 to 6 weeks of this pandemic, when we didn't know what we were dealing with, I think it was appropriate and prudent to shutter Parliament. Now that we do, I think we need to get back to business. The government needs to be held accountable. Enough of these press conferences with no accountability. We need to get back to work, and Parliament needs to be reopened.
So I posted something on social media over the weekend, and it just blew up because I think people's frustrations were showing. It was basically a post, which was rather innocent looking, of 4 cabinet ministers saying they're going kayaking in Ottawa. But we're being told constantly as the opposition that Ottawa is too dangerous. We can't bring back Parliament because it is just way too dangerous. But yet we're going to stay in Ottawa and we're going to go kayaking. Everyone deserves R&R, but that's not the point. The point is we're being told Parliament, our greatest institution, is being shuttered because it's too dangerous, but yet let's hang out and go kayaking.
Yeah, it's clear, as the days and weeks go on, it becomes increasingly clear that the government sees Parliament as an inconvenience, that they're not really committed to democratic principles. And as I said, it's a crisis that usually brings out these kinds of issues. They're failing democracy. They came to office in 2015 on a great promise of greater democracy. It was one of the top 2 or 3 things that they promised Canadians. And they broke almost every one of their democratic reform promises. They broke their promise on electoral reform. They introduced partisanship into our national media. They put Unifor, a clearly partisan group, on the national media, on the media bailout fund. They tried to take over PMO control of the House of Commons last Parliament in Motion 6.
That's right, Elbowgate.
That's right. They would have given PMO an extraordinary amount of power to control the House of Commons, far beyond what the previous Harper government had ever even thought about. And more recently, yesterday, we had confirmed in the report tabled in the committee that the government rigged the leaders' debate in the last election to their own benefit. They, through an order in council of October 2018, set a priori conditions in place as to who could participate, guaranteeing that the People's Party of Canada would be able to participate in these debates, disadvantaging the Conservatives and advantaging the Liberals. The report yesterday that was tabled from the Debates Commission clearly confirmed that. And so today, they've taken it another step. They've shuttered Parliament. So clearly they see democracy as an annoyance, an inconvenience. Their past actions speak to it, and the shuttering of Parliament till September 21st is further evidence of that.
And I just want to confirm, Michael, maybe you could reiterate too, a bunch of falsehoods were promoted just recently by the Prime Minister, saying that Conservatives wanted 338 MPs back, and not once, not ever did we say that. And Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, recently said that Conservatives didn't want to sit through the summer, which is absolutely untrue, because we were the ones pushing for Parliament to come back in the first place, and we were the only ones doing it.
You've hit the nail on the head. I think two things have to happen. The full House of Commons, with its full powers, needs to return with full social distancing. Those are the two things that need to be in place. We need the House of Commons with all its powers to resume sitting as it normally would at this time. And the second thing we need to do is ensure that we have appropriate social distancing in order to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. We can do both of those things. How do we know that? Other legislatures, other national assemblies around the world are doing exactly that. How else do we know that? Millions of Canadians are going to work every day in places where dozens, if not hundreds of people work, in manufacturing, in distribution, in hospitals. They have protocols in place to ensure the safety and security of their workers. We can do the same thing. Unfortunately, the government worked out this deal with the NDP that has suspended full Parliament till September 21st. And during this time, hundreds of billions of dollars are going out the door with very little oversight. Changes are being made to programs and to other laws with very little oversight, and that needs to change. We need to get back to work.
Maybe we can just close on this too. And another casualty, you touched on this earlier, another casualty of this is the ongoing business of Parliament, including private members' business. Now, given that private members' bills rarely become law, but there is a chance. But for many people who have hit the lottery, so to speak, where they drew a number that would get them the ability to put forward their piece of legislation, which is near and dear to their heart, at the top of the list, so to speak, they're being basically pushed to the side. That private members' business isn't going to happen, and these people might not have the chance to put forward any piece of legislation in the future, depending on how their career goes forward.
Well, that's exactly it. So private members' business has been suspended because Parliament isn't sitting. Private members' motions cannot be introduced. Concurrence and reports cannot happen. Committees cannot meet to call witnesses, to provide recommendations, to make suggestions. None of that is happening right now because of the suspension of the House. But most importantly, when the House is suspended, as it is right now, the confidence convention is not in force. And so confidence cannot be tested. And this is particularly important because the Liberals do not have a majority. They have a minority, but they are governing right now like they have a majority because they can, because they worked out this deal to suspend Parliament till September 21st. So the confidence that this government the confidence of the government that should be continually tested in the House of Commons is simply not taking place. They've got unfettered powers to spend on what they want. They've got unfettered powers to change certain pieces of legislation without parliamentary approval. That's got to change. We now know what we're dealing with COVID-19. We know the vulnerable populations that we need to protect. Seniors over the age of 70, old age homes, long-term care facilities, other vulnerable populations. We can reopen the House of Commons with its full powers with social distancing, and the government needs to do it now.
Okay, Michael Chong, we'll close on this. I'll let you finish with this. Where is the outrage that you saw during the Harper years when Harper did, like, he prorogued Parliament, and then the media and the left went absolutely nuts? We're actually seeing it taken many steps worse right now with the erosion of our parliamentary democracy. Where is the outrage? Where are the same people who were screaming from the rooftops?
Well, it certainly seems much more muted now than it did back when Harper prorogued Parliament. But I would say this, it's early days yet. As the weeks turn into the next month or two, I think Canadians are going to come to the conclusion that we have, which is that Parliament needs to be reopened. The government needs to be held accountable for the sake of our children and our grandchildren.
Michael Chong, Member of Parliament for Wellington-Halton Hills, the Shadow Minister for Democratic Institutions. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Always the voice of reason, as I say, and do appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, Michael Chong. Coming up next, we have Greg McLean, the Member of Parliament for Calgary Centre. He's also the Deputy Shadow Minister for National Revenue. We're going to talk about some of the spending measures the Liberals have been doing in this COVID-19 crisis. So, as always, hold tight. We have part 2 coming up. Remember, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint. Welcome back to part 2 of The Blueprint, Canada's Conservative podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, broadcasting live from my constituency office in the beautiful town of Lindsay, Ontario. We had a great guest, Michael Chong, in the first half of the show to talk about how the Liberals and NDP are teaming up to shut down our parliamentary democracy right here in Canada, right under our noses as we approach the summer season and people are dealing with the lockdown, business closures, etc. So now on the second half of the show, we have Greg McLean. He's the Member of Parliament for Calgary Centre. He's also the Deputy Shadow Minister for National Revenue. We're going to talk about some of the spending measures that have been put in place for the businesses, for the individuals have been told to shut down or stay home because of obviously COVID-19. So thank you, Greg, for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me, Jamie. Great to see you.
Okay. Well, nice to see you as well. I guess you and Michael are back in Ottawa. You're putting up the good fights. It's not Parliament. It's committee. I think we should point that out. How is it going? You were just there.
Pretty good. I had my questions for about 2.5 minutes of questions. I was trying to grill the Prime Minister in the House yesterday, but he wasn't there. As usual, he was there today for a little bit, giving speeches on racism, and that was an important part of the House of Commons today. But and I had an SO 31, as we call it, Standing Order 31, 1-minute speech today. So, using my time wisely while we get allocated our time in our seats in Ottawa.
So let's talk about these spending measures that have been put in place. The Parliamentary Budget Officer seems to think our national debt will eclipse $1 trillion. We have Billions of dollars being shoveled out the door with little to no parliamentary oversight. You're a new MP just elected in 2019, and hopefully will have a long career as a parliamentarian. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts are that this is something we're going to have to come to grips with sooner rather than later. It's the whittling down of these programs that has to happen afterwards that's going to be the real challenge this government has to face. And that is something we're going to have to come back into the House of Commons and deal with in the fall. There is no doubt we had to push money out to make sure that people that were told to stay home had the financing to make sure that they paid their bills in the interim, especially people that had jobs that were told not to show up at those jobs, and you can't continue to expect your employer to fund you if you're not showing up to work anymore. So the government wisely, I think, pushed money out to those people. Whether it did it efficiently or not is another question, because there is that whole gaps we've seen. I think most of the members of Parliament have done what I've been doing over the last 3 months, which is finding those holes and making sure that people that should be receiving the government subsidy are actually getting that to them, as opposed to a little hole where they don't quite fit into the program. The programs are designed, I think, by committee and usually by bureaucratic committee. And we need to look at a lot of that and say, why was this designed this way? Fix it, because there's some people that are falling through the cracks.
So you are the Deputy Shadow Minister for National Revenue. So let's talk about what was launched today, the snitch line by the Canada Revenue Agency, to try to take on some of the people who have collected the CERB, the emergency benefit, $1,000 a month, that probably shouldn't have. Do we have any thoughts on that as you're looking into this?
Well, we've looked at all of it. I think we all know people. I was getting my hair cut by somebody earlier this week that actually said that she'd received 2 checks at once. So she says she's sending one back, but this is happening throughout the pandemic that's happening here. And it's not just 2 CERB checks, for instance. It might be a CERB check and a CEWS check or a student check. There's multiple layering going on here as far as the subsidies that are available to different people that are applying for government programs. Sometimes the government is making those mistakes themselves, and sometimes they're being made intentionally by others. You take a look at it, they say that more than 1 million people were subscribing to CERB than were eligible for it at the end of the day. So 1 million more people subscribing to CERB that are actually not employed. That's a big gap. I don't know what a snitch line does. Snitch line, you're going to call in on your neighbor. This is something that they should be further ahead of than having your neighbors call you saying, look, I know somebody that's breaking the rules. I don't know how you enforce something like that, or what motivates somebody to call in on their neighbor saying, I know somebody that received $2,000 too much. I think it's something the government should probably have more of a grip on themselves.
So I think one thing we have to examine as the money gets put out the door is the origin of the dollar. Where are these dollars coming from that the government is spending? They're taking in less revenue because people are spending less in the economy in certain cases. Businesses are not able to pay their taxes in certain ways. Where's this money coming from that we're putting out the door?
All governments through this process. So not just Canadian governments, but international governments as well. But provincial governments too have to issue bonds in the treasury markets at this point in time in order to pay for the programs that they're instilling during this pandemic. So every government has been in the treasury markets, and that's why the Bank of Canada is there as well, trying to shrink that, what they call the bid-ask spread between where bonds would be marked to market in a normally functioning market where buyers are coming in. Bank of Canada comes in as well as a buyer, as well as the issuer, more or less shrinks that bid-ask spread, so we still have low interest rates in Canada. That's what is affecting that. But effectively, governments are at the trough trying to make sure they can finance the subsidies and the programs we have that are part of this pandemic response.
So as we get to the recovery, you're still going to need the access to credit somewhere. There's going to be businesses that might need it, government, so to speak. So where would someone say in the energy industry, you're the province of Alberta, where would some of the industry fight for those rare dollars now that they're being taken from other means?
So those dollars aren't really being taken from other means right now. So the new entrance into the capital markets is the governments, or the central banks, if you will, which are arms of the governments in every country they're in. So really, you're having a whole bunch of money flooding into the financial system here. I don't think there's ever going to be a shortage of money. It's just the price of that money that'll have to be paid at the end of the day. The reason the central banks are there is to try and mitigate that escalation in the price of that cost of money, if you will, at this point in time. So more money will come into there. It'll be artificially put into the banking system as a result of the central bank's actions across the world. That's not just confined to the major economies right now. That is across the world where we're addressing this COVID response. Everybody is issuing what we call quantitative easing. So you have a whole bunch of interests in here that are really devaluing the currencies around the world. Now, how do you devalue currencies around the world when they're all priced one versus the other? And what really happens here is we devalue the human input to our goods and services. Because tangible goods all have a world price to them. Human goods, quite frankly, labor is what gets cheapened down here. So the Canadian dollar might still be worth the same amount in US dollars, but both of us have devalued that input. There are currencies around the world that are not marked to market, that are government set as far as their exchange rate goes. The yuan, the renminbi being probably the most prevalent at this point in time because of how much of the world they actually occupy on the financial spectrum.
Now, we've heard a lot about Justin Trudeau talking about debt to GDP ratio, and that's going to take a bit of a hit, quite a bit of a hit because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But also, just before COVID happened, and for the 4 years in the previous parliament, I think we as the official opposition as Conservatives stood up day in and day out talking about why fiscal responsibility matters, why we should be paying off our debt in the good times, saving for the bad times. And the Liberals just said, nah, we're good. The bad times aren't coming. Well, unfortunately, to the Canadians who are watching their business get evaporated or being told to stay at home, wondering what's going to happen in the future, the bad times are here.
The government fixated on this ratio called the debt to GDP ratio, and it is a measurement, but it's a false measurement. It's measuring ourselves against other debtor nations at this point in time and how bad we're doing versus how bad they're doing. Anytime a government borrows, it should have a plan about how it pays back that borrowing. There's no benefit. The governments can come and tell you that, well, corporations have balance sheets layered with debt. The only reason to have debt in a corporation is because you get a tax advantage on the capital input as debt as opposed to the capital input as equity. There is no such tax advantage in government. So having a ratio that includes debt on a government's balance sheet is a misnomer from the beginning. It is an excuse to run debts in the country and continue running debts when we don't need to run debts. Paying off the debt in the good times, this is Keynesian economics. Whenever anybody comes at you and says, well, Keynesian says spend in the bad times, they're right. But what do you do in the good times? You have to pay back the spending. But politicians lack the discipline to actually pull money out of the economy and pay it back, because it does actually have an effect on not growing the economy as quickly if you're actually paying back debt. That's the issue. But now we have quantitative easing. So you look at what happens over the last 12 years in the US when they entered quantitative easing. Notably, in 2008-2009 recession, Canada did not succumb to quantitative easing in its bank system. The US did. So it issued about $4.5 trillion worth of extra money. So money printing, if you will, at that point in time on the balance sheet of the Fed, which is the equivalent of our Bank of Canada. That distorted money markets throughout the world, really, but particularly in the Western world. That distortion of the financial balance sheet has never come off. In the last 4 years, the Fed tried coming off about 5% of that, and every time they came off, the markets would sink like crazy, about triple the money coming out of the quantitative easing program. So every time that any kind of financial measurement is taken, you have to look at what happens when you put your foot on the brake, because speeding up is one thing, but you come into that stop sign, you better know where the brake is and what happens.
Well, I heard it in Parliament today. Justin Trudeau was looking back when the recession of 2008 started, and the Conservatives, prior to that happened, paid off about $40 billion in national debt and started making that process before the crash happened. But also the fact that when we balanced it in 2015 and actually had a surplus in our budget, the way the programs were targeted was that they opened the taps so that money was able to flow for infrastructure. And then as the years went by, they slowly turned it off. And of 2015, it kind of went back to normal levels and allowed the economy, which was the fastest to recover in the G7, to do what it does best.
Yeah, and a couple things there. Recognize that $10 billion in surplus in 2008 and then going $50 billion into deficit was a plan, and the plan was to go into deficit in the short term, but there was also the plan to come out of deficit, and the government followed that plan. The government followed that plan and came out of it clearly in 2015. So well done, well executed. That's what governments are supposed to do: lay out the plan and execute against that plan. Mission accomplished. Good thing. There is no plan in this government. I mean, you're in the House of Commons as I am. We're always asking, where is your plan on finances here? Particularly in COVID, it's just, okay, just keep shoveling money out the door at this point in time. We'll deal with the plan going forward down the road. So it is a can-kicking exercise, as we say, about when we actually have to face the music on what we're spending.
Well, just before we turned on the cameras here for the podcast, Pierre Poilievre, our finance critic, was in the House of Commons for Fake Parliament to ask the finance minister a few questions. And one of them was, how much debt does the Communist Party of China own from Canada? And there was no answer.
There's rarely an answer from the finance minister. Pierre is very good at asking those questions to the finance minister and just drilling into them. Now, the finance minister should have his hands on the numbers, and yet he doesn't. I'm not sure if he doesn't intentionally just because he doesn't want to answer, or if he actually doesn't know. If he's just actually not prepared enough in the House of Commons to answer difficult questions. But if you think about it, if you're a treasurer of a large corporation and your CEO comes and says, I need this number, some of those numbers you better have at your fingertips right away.
Absolutely. Well, Greg, we only have a couple, less than a minute left here. Let's talk about the energy industry quickly. You're a Calgary member from Alberta. It was hard going prior to this because of a lot of legislation the Liberals put in. You have a lot of people who are unemployed, underemployed in your province. Are they seeing, you still haven't had a recovery package from the Liberals to deal with the oil and gas sector. What's the mood like in Alberta?
Mood is dire, and yet we will come through this. The issues, there are strident issues that are happening in Alberta right now. And of course, being the opposition party, we do get a lot of mail, we get a lot of emails asking, what are you doing? Because this government is destroying this country. So we need you to stand up. We need you to put a motion of no confidence onto the floor of the House of Commons. Now, it's people that, obviously do not understand where we are as far as, number one, Parliament not sitting, and number two, how do you actually, as a minority parliament, without the acceptance of the other opposition parties, get something like a vote of no confidence? You're going to have a confidence motion on a bill, first of all, as we move forward here. So there's the misconception of what's going on, but people are irate. You look at the discrimination, and I'll put it that way, that this government has had for 5 years against this country's largest economic driver, which is the oil and gas industry. It is a big chunk of our GDP. Over $100 billion of our GDP every year is a function of the oil and gas industry. $77 billion positive on our balance of payments as a result of the oil and gas sector. A huge, huge part of our international and national economy. Let's accept that. Let's look at how we actually deal with it. The problem is that this federal government isn't even following their own laws about how we work interjurisdictionally between provinces. So there is a lot going on and a lot of tension happening in Alberta and in the oil and gas industry regarding the federal government and what they have to do in order to make this work for the country. When I say the country, Alberta is a part of the country. So we're not one separate entity. The benefit that the oil and gas brings to Alberta, it brings in spades to the rest of the country as well. The amount of taxation revenue contributes to $8 billion a year towards social programs that we benefit from across Canada. And that's something that is a frustration you'll see amongst many Albertans, is where we think we're adding so much value to Canada and in Canada's social infrastructure, its national infrastructure, and its expenses on an international basis. And yet we seem to be getting marginalized more and more as far as our economic input goes. That's something that I believe strongly we have to change.
Greg McLean, thank you very much for joining us. I have many more questions for you, but unfortunately we are out of time. I love talking finances with you. You know your stuff, and I do appreciate that as well.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Anytime, I'm happy to come on. I really appreciate being here.
We will have you back on. Absolutely, 100% we're having you back on. That's Greg McLean. He's the Member of Parliament for Calgary Centre. He's also the Deputy Shadow Minister for National Revenue, talking about some of the spending measures the Liberals have brought in during COVID-19. I want to thank you once again for joining us here today. We'll be back next Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time with another edition of The Blueprint. And please remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, help us push back against the Liberal agenda. You can watch it here on Facebook. We have it on Twitter. Also, if you want to listen to it as you go about your daily routine, we're on CastBox, Spotify, iTunes, Google Play Music, you name it, we're out there. So thank you again, once again, for joining us today and help us spread this message. So, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the Blueprint. Thank you.